Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, worshippers of all ages, welcome to YouTube. My name is SeaRaptor, and today we're bringing you a first look at Tier VIII Premium Japanese cruiser, Tone. Tone's model has been in the game files for literally years. Well, I'm lying a little bit. It was in the game files at launch, and then at some point after launch, it was removed. And then now here we are, nearly 5 years later, it's back again as Wargaming finally has a solid concept of how to incorporate hybrid ships into the game. Raptor, what are you talking about? What the hell's a hybrid ship in World of Warships? I'm so glad you asked this question. Let's chat for a minute and talk you through what I mean. Ordinarily, when you look at a ship like a standard heavy cruiser here, you see all these guns and everything, you would not see this aircraft tab, right? This tab generally is reserved for aircraft carriers, but Tone here, by virtue of the fact that you see these aircraft facilities on her stern, she has access to a single squadron of planes that she can put up into the air, very much like an aircraft carrier can put a single squadron of planes up into the air. This variant of Tone, for example, has access to a torpedo bomber squadron of 4 planes. They all make one attack run at once. You see there, aircraft per squadron is 4, size of attacking flight is 4. Each ship has 2 torpedoes in the payload. So this squadron, as an example, would operate similarly to how a FDR or a Saipan squadron would operate, in the sense of it puts 8 torpedoes into the water and gets 1 attack run, and then it's done. Now, while that's going on, of course, just like an aircraft carrier, when you're driving the planes, you cannot be driving your hull. So you have to rely on, moving around the map on your autopilot, for example. But Tone is one of 2 ships being added to the game for testing that incorporates this mechanic, this ship with guns and planes. The other one is Tier VI Battleship Issei, and we'll look at Issei in another video. But we're going to talk about Tone here because Tone is one of the most requested ships ever in World of Warships. I've seen people asking about this ship literally weekly for 5 years, and here we're finally in the client, and she can actually be tested. The only reason that this concept works, in my opinion, is because of the carrier rework. They would never have been able to attempt this under the old system. It just never would have functioned. But now it can be done. It's going to introduce its own set of balance and strategery issues, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I won't delve too deep because it's too early to make calls, but I can make some predictions and what I think is going to happen, and then we can talk about this. But it opens up some really, really interesting design space here. The Japanese were not the only nation to attempt this. And so if this works, if they can pull this off, we might see this concept in other places. Let's have a look at the hull, and we'll talk more about the planes in a minute. First things first, let's check over the hull. Hit points here, 38,900, pretty typical of a Japanese high-tier heavy cruiser. Atago, by comparison, comes in at 40,100 hit points. So you're a little on the low side, but fairly comparable. Nothing to complain about, but nothing notable. 13% torpedo protection, again, a little lower than some of her contemporaries in this tier, but I mean, it's a heavy cruiser. Torpedo protection is not what you're going to be known for. It's a cruiser. There's only so much tonnage to go around. Torpedo bulges are not necessarily going to be where your big focus is. Armor layout. You see here, mostly 27mm extremities here on the deck and the upper works. So she will take a fair number of full HE pins if she finds herself in close range with an IFHE light cruiser, for example. Certainly battleships will be able to drop shells through her deck. That is something that she does not necessarily share with Atago. Her deck armor is not as good. And then, of course, the bow, 25mm on the bow means that she absolutely cannot bow tank some of the higher caliber battleship shells that she will run into in her matchmaking bracket. Some of the lower caliber ones possibly, depends on the battleship, but in general, that's not a thing. Artillery, let's look at maneuverability and concealment. 35.5 knots. Again, very comparable. This is the same top speed that Atago has. Turning circle, 780 meters. Again, very, very comparable to Atago and Mogami. Rudder shift time is definitely slower than Atago by about a couple of seconds or so. This is not something that's going to radically impact how she handles, but it will impact how maneuverable she is under fire, in the sense of, you put that rudder over, she's just a little slower to respond than Atago is. If you've played an Atago, you know how wiggly she is. She's very maneuverable. You can kind of dodge out of the way of certain incoming salvos and whatnot. Tony's going to have a little harder time doing that. Now, I will say that Tone has something else going for her, though, and that is literally best in tier detection. You see here with her camouflage on, she starts at a 10.8 base detection. By the time you rig her up with a concealment expert captain and a concealment module in upgrade slot 5, she will drop to an 8.8 kilometer detection on the surface. That is actually best in tier for a cruiser. That's pretty awesome and fairly noteworthy. You know, it's one of the things that we talk when you talk about Atago and some of the other Japanese heavy cruisers in this tier. That stealth is something, you know, that they're able to flex. Certainly, it is with Atago, who I think comes in around 9.3 now, and that's really awesome. This is even better. This is even better than that. She's going to need that stealth, especially when she's got her planes in the air and she's not actively firing her guns. That gives her a little bit more breathing room in the sense of she can try to be hiding or repositioning. This a well played Tone, I feel like, with this concealment and the way she's configured, will definitely be a very high skill ceiling ship. And I'm excited to try this thing out once we get the opportunity. But yeah, best in tier detection at the moment when you rig this thing up for it. She will be 5.8 detection on the surface. That's the max range of her aerial defenses, and we'll get to that in a minute. Artillery. She has 4 of these double-barreled 203mm turrets. These are all fully forward. If you've played Miyoko or Atago, you're used to this configuration, this super firing middle turret with the number 3 turret facing aft. What you're probably not used to is this extra turret. Atago is one of the only cruisers that I know of that has 4 turrets forward of her superstructure. So here, this D turret, also aft facing, just like they've copied the C turret, they pasted it back here as a D turret, and so all of her gunpowder is on the bow. That is unusual for a cruiser, and it's going to give her a very interesting and unique kind of play style. I had a look at her gun angles over in the Game Models 3D, and I'll post the graphic here. You can kind of see there that to get off of all of the guns, off of the port side or the starboard side, you've got to give up looks like about 25-ish or so degrees off the hull. But then also, if you look, she's got a decent kiting angle going back over either her right or her left shoulder. So again, Japanese cruisers very commonly play best when enemies are pushing into them. They're able to kite. They're able to get their guns looking over their shoulder and their torpedo armament into the battle, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And Tone is no exception here. She has some decent gun angles for doing that. But again, her armor scheme may not necessarily stand up to that. Now, we didn't talk about that, so let's go have a quick look real briefly. I talked about the extremities. I didn't talk about her belt. That's my bad. She has 145 millimeters of belt armor up here near the bow. Of course, this is protecting her magazine citadels, but her machinery spaces are only protected by 100 millimeters of belt armor. So this is almost kind of not what you want to see if you want to be in a kiting position, right? Like, it just doesn't. It does not lend itself well. She does have a small turtle back here. Let me give you a better angle on it. You can kind of see it there. She's got that 67mm sloped deck, which is nice. But at the same time, this is an above the waterline, an elevated citadel here for her machinery spaces. You probably don't want to find out if this turtleback is going to help you or not. If you're in that situation, it's probably already not a good thing. And then, of course, let's talk about her torpedoes. Go back and look at the other half of her main armament. She's carrying the same torpedoes as Atago. These are 10 kilometers, 62 knots, 17,200 alpha, but she carries them in 4 triple launchers instead of 4 quads like Atago does. And you can see here, look at the tips on those torpedoes. These are aft-facing launchers. Again, I went and had a look in Game Models 3D. I'll post the graphics here. You see there, most of her torpedo arcs are definitely stern-focused. So if you find yourself in a, running away from the enemy, them pushing into you, able to shoot over your shoulder, you're definitely going to be able to maximize Tone's armament. This is not a pushing cruiser, right? Most Japanese cruisers aren't. Tone is not either. That all kind of fits together. Anti-aircraft defenses. Not anything to write home about here. She's got 3 flak bursts in her outer range there, 60 DPS on the outer ring, 203 in the inner ring. She has no middle ring. This is very typical. Atago's AA is set up like this. She doesn't want to be attacked by airplanes. She just doesn't want it. Like, do not want. Please don't bring your planes over here. There's not much that she can do with them. And this is even further compounded by the fact that she cannot take a catapult fighter consumable, which seems completely bizarro when you look back here at all of these plane facilities. But no. There is no catapult fighter consumable available for Tone, so she is highly vulnerable to enemy carriers. This is the kind of ship that definitely wants to hang near friends that have a little bit of AA if she has the opportunity to do so. Certainly while her planes are out doing their thing, because while your hull is on autopilot and you're driving the planes looking for a target, there's not much you can do there to defend yourself and turn your rudder and avoid let's say dive bombs, for example. An enemy carrier wants to come at you with some AP dive bombs. You're busy driving a squadron. Oops, right? I mean, you're not going to be actively maneuvering to try and dodge those unless you send the planes back, which is a whole other ball of wax. Let's have a look at the equipment, and we will get into talking about the planes. So consumables-wise, you're going to get a heal. This is actually really, really awesome. I'm glad to see this. I think she's going to need this. And then you get a choice between defensive fire and hydroacoustic search. To me, guys, defensive fire is the easy choice here. A ship like Tone really should not be out hunting destroyers. It's just not what she does well. So I don't know that I would ever pick this. No, defensive fire is not going to do amazing things for her A, but it certainly isn't going to hurt. And this is a ship that wants to hold the range open at pretty much at all costs. Like, you just don't want to be out. You don't want to be hunting destroyers in this ship. If you're in that situation, things are very, very desperate indeed. Now, while we're in here, I want to point something out, okay? We were talking about the planes earlier. When you load out a carrier, you get all these options for making your planes faster or hit harder or have more health or whatever, reload faster. Tone has access to none of those. Those are carrier-only modifications. So all of the modifications Tone has access to here are the exact same ones you would expect for any other surface heavy cruiser at Tier 8. Okay, now is that going to stay the case? I don't know, but that's how they're testing her right now. You will not have that restriction on the commander. So if you want to have a commander that has survivability expert, for example, to give you a little extra health on the planes or something like that, you can do that because you'll be getting double use out of survivability expert. It'll be buffing your plane health and your hull health, and of course making your heal hit a little bigger. Lots of benefits there, some good synergy in that particular skill, as an example. So speccing a captain out for these hybrid ships, certainly under the current system, is a challenge. I think it's going to be even more challenging under the new system that Wargaming has proposed that we should be getting a look at very next patch, is because those skill trees are literally focused on cruiser or battleship or aircraft carrier. So there's not even any possibility to have any kind of overlap or synergy. It's just like there's going to be cruiser only skills in this tree. So I'll be really curious to see how it all plays out. All right, so let's talk about the planes, right? Because that's kind of the ship's gimmick. So let's have a quick look at this. All right, no, not that tab, that tab. All right, Tone gets a single squadron of 4 torpedo bombers. Each one puts 2 into the water. Now, as I mentioned I think I mentioned earlier, right now they're testing this ship in several different iterations. They're testing her with torpedo bombers. They're testing her with, I think, HE dive bombers, and I think AP dive bombers, okay? So I don't believe they're testing her with rockets. I could be wrong, but there's several different test variants out there. They're trying to figure out what type of plane to put on the ship, okay? So you see there, I mean, she's got the same kind of things you would expect. Of course, the planes will have engine boost and so on and so forth. Uncharacteristically for Japanese torpedoes, these are very slow. You see there are 35 knots on those torpedoes and only a 2800 alpha. That is pathetic. That makes midway torpedoes look like they hit hard. Some of that is because she puts 8 of these torpedoes into the water. And so what Wargaming is trying to do here, obviously, is kind of corral in the entire alpha strike down to something a little more reasonable. Something else that's worth noting there, you see their detectability range, 7.5 kilometers. By the time you stack Concealment Expert on the captain and then Concealment Expert on the hull, the detection on these bombers is going to be pretty low. And so this is just like Kaga's torpedo bombers. These planes have the potential to be kind of those sort of thing that, like, I can already have them on the deck running in for an attack before you even know that they're there. So that gives you some really interesting tactical options with these planes. And of course, you see the restoration time, 2 minutes per plane, is significant because you have very, very few ways to reduce that. You can't do it by a mod, but there is a 1-point captain skill you could throw at it that would reduce that by about 6 seconds. I'm not sure it's really worth it. It probably isn't. The torpedo bombers on this ship in particular are very obviously meant to be the sort of armament that you make use of maybe 2 or 3 times over the course of a match. You don't have big squadrons, you don't have lots of planes available, and so you cannot lean on them for very long. Now, here's how I kind of envision this type of ship playing out in a random battle, though, right? Because let's say that neither team has a carrier, but your team has a Tone and the other team does not. You, as the Tone driver, can take your torpedo bomber squadron and put it up in the air and get some really good early scouting information on the enemy team. This is information that the enemy team cannot get in return because they do not have any ships on their team paired up that have access to planes like that, okay? So even if you never drop those torpedo bombers, just by virtue of the fact that you put them up early and go get some scouting information, as provided your team is smart enough to make use of it, that can be a huge advantage, especially in competitive modes. Think about Tier 8 ranked, for example. Or a ranked season where carriers aren't allowed, even if that ever becomes a thing again. So yeah, that can be really cool. Similarly, in the mid game, let's assume for a minute that Tone is on a flank. How many times in a random battle do you see your Tone's on a flank and you just rolled up the enemy like a carpet? There's nothing left to shoot at. Tone can then maybe turn around, set her waypoint, set an autopilot waypoint for the other side of the map, grab those torpedo bombers, lift those off, and then go look for something to be doing while the hull repositions to be more useful. And then once the torpedo bombers have done their attack, you go back, you drive the hull, you fire at the guns and the torpedoes for a little while, and do your thing. There's a tremendous amount of really interesting design space with this kind of ship concept. The trick is that aerial spotting advantage, giving that to one team and not the other, opens up some potential for abuse. It even gets worse, quote unquote worse, potentially worse, when you start saying, oh, I know, I'll get my two buddies, will form a division of 3 Tones, and now, let's say I get matchmaking without a carrier. Now I have basically like 3 pocket carriers, right? I can put all my torpedo squadrons up early, go pick on an enemy battleship, and then go back to my hull, and then, shoot my guns for a while my planes regen, and then do that again in the mid-game, go pick on a battleship, and so on and so forth. It has the potential to be a little quite unfun to play against and potentially a little abusive, especially in divisions. So I'm really curious to see how they opt to balance this. If Tone ends up being some kind of ship with special matchmaking, or Issei for that example, hybrids are not their own class at the moment, right? This is just a cruiser. Matchmaking is going to treat this like any other cruiser, but those planes give you a decisive tactical advantage, strategic advantage, I really should say, certainly in the early spotting, in the early game, and potentially in the mid and the late game, depending on how you decide to use those torpedo bombers or dive bombers or AP bombers. We don't know where she's going to land in terms of how those planes are going to come out, what kind of plane she's going to have at launch. Anyway, guys, there you go. First look at Tone. I'm excited to try this ship. This is really cool that they're trying this. I just fear that they're definitely going to have some balance struggles with it, and we're going to have to see how they decide to tackle it. In the meantime, guys, wash your hands, be safe out there, and I'll catch you next time.